Hello to all of you. Welcome back. Those of you who were here last week for Weekend with Shakespeare. Those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm very glad to see you too, or at least to be aware of your presence. And this is How to Live Like Shakespeare, a collaboration with my dear friend, Julia Lupton, professor of English at UC Irvine, and the director there of the new Swan Shakespeare Center. I just want to pick up where we ended last time with Kathleen Bonner's very perceptive comment that it's not at all clear how we should apply the passages that we're discussing to the opportunities and challenges of being alive. That is, how to live like Shakespeare. Now, Kathleen got me thinking about the purposes of reading as Shakespeare and his contemporaries may have understood them. Like us, the Elizabethans read for information, they read for pleasure. But unlike us, or so I think, they also took it for granted that the purpose of serious and worthwhile reading was wisdom, and through wisdom, the transformation of perspective and behavior. So, for example, in the Elizabethan sermon known as A Fruitful Exhortation to the Reading and Knowledge of Holy Scripture, which was read out from every English pulpit annually, churchgoers were reminded that in these books we may learn to know ourselves. And so the point of gaining self-knowledge was to change one's life. And interestingly, similar claims were made about secular works as well, provided that they were sufficiently prestigious. For example, works of Greek and Roman antiquity, such as Virgil's Aeneid and Ovid's Metamorphoses. They were often defended on the grounds that they led to self-knowledge and transformed perspective and behavior. That homily I just mentioned also says that, quote, in reading God's word, he most profiteth, not always that is most ready in the turning of the book, so not the person who's able to have the pages at his fingertips, or in saying of it without the book, that is the person who's memorized it, but he that is most turned into it, is most inspired with the Holy Ghost, most in his heart and life altered, changed into that thing which he readeth. So in this argument, reading for wisdom means becoming the book, a very special kind of book, granted from this point of view. But my question is, how do you do that? How do you become the book that you read? And the homily is totally silent on that point. Apart from the inspiration that the Holy Spirit might provide, we appear to be on our own as individuals to work out the relationship between what we read and how we live. I think that Shakespeare, who is our secular scripture in this series, leaves us with a similar predicament and opportunity. He was acutely aware that in his own period, his modern plays did not have the status of serious ancient works. The difference between plays and works, I think, is meaningful in the Elizabethan context. Plays aren't repositories of wisdom. They don't deserve or repay contemplation, or so many Elizabethans thought. To the contrary, plays were mass entertainments and therefore belonged to the category of trifles or ink-wasting toys, to which Sir Philip Sidney consigned even his own writings, if you know those poems of his. So I would argue that Shakespeare's awareness of the low status of his art form and its lack of authority to speak about important human matters is felt in every passage that we might want to call wise. All of Shakespeare's wisdom is embodied in characters whose follies and limitations are all too obvious to us. And you might think of the classic example here, which is Polonius in Hamlet. He is thoroughly steeped in the wisdom traditions that are circulating through Shakespeare's culture, and he is totally blind to the reality of his circumstances and to the consequences of his decisions for the people whom he loves, especially Ophelia. Richard II, the vicar of our speech for today, is also a very unlikely source of wisdom. He organizes the murder of an uncle before the play begins. He banishes two kinsmen in order to cover up that crime. As a man, he is vain and greedy. As a king, he's profligate and imprudent. And when his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, launches a rebellion against him, Richard gives himself over entirely to self-pity. In a word, he is what his cousin calls him in Act 3, discontented. So that word, like its synonym, antonym, contented, appears in English for the first time in the 16th century, and it really gathers steam in Shakespeare's works. All told, variations on content and discontent appear more than 250 times in Shakespeare's plays and poems. Now, I'm not trying to discourage you from applying what Richard has to say to your own experiences. I only want to remind us that it's no simple matter to discern where the common ground between him and ourselves really lies, or how to translate his experiences in the play into wisdom that we can use, much less to alter and change ourselves into the speech that we're reading today. Changing and altering yourself into the speech that you read is what an actor does. So one possibility is that Shakespeare is asking us to think of reading as a kind of performance through which we learn what it's like to be other people, and in that way become what we read, at least for the time being. And so now and throughout this series, I really encourage you to be aware about the ways in which you do and do not feel moved to identify with Shakespeare's speakers. That is telling you something about the way the text is attempting to fit itself to your own life experiences. Okay, so one of the reasons why it's difficult for us to work out how Richard's experiences might speak wisely to us is that there are a number of unfamiliar assumptions working in the background of his speech at the top of Act 5. Assumptions about the way the world is ordered and about the efficacy and significance of human activity within the order. And I am going to try to give you a sense of those assumptions by gesturing quickly to a few books that inform Shakespeare's writing in this play. Our topic today is contentment, and there is the citation for the speech. So the first book that I want to mention is the one you see before you here, or you see its title page. It's called The Mirror for Magistrates, and it's a collection of dramatic monologues in verse, and I will read you the full title there. A mirror for magistrates, wherein may be seen by example of other, with how grievous plagues vices are punished, and how frail and unstable worldly prosperity is found, even of those whom fortune seemeth most highly to favor. Mirror for Magistrates is an English imitation of a 14th century collection of biographies of real and legendary people written by Giovanni Boccaccio under the title De Casibus Illustrium Virorum, which means concerning the downfalls or concerning the misfortunes of illustrious men. And here you see an illuminated page from a 15th century translation of Boccaccio, and this image really gives the gist of the book's contents. Despite their best efforts to remain on top, all manner of people from Adam and Eve to Italian aristocrats in Boccaccio's own time period are broken on fortune's wheel. Here you see Fortune giving the wheel a spin. Here is Boccaccio on the left-hand side, and behind him stretches a long line of celebrities waiting to take the ride of their lives. In its 1559 edition, Mirror for Magistrates focused specifically on the War of the Roses, a conflict between two branches of the House of Plantagenet, which ruled England in the previous century. The speakers of those dramatic monologues are mainly nobles who participated in the wars. They speak from beyond the grave about the causes of their downfalls. They draw helpful lessons about the mistakes they made. And not surprisingly, Richard II, whose reign belongs to the prehistory of that civil war, is a prominent figure in Mirror for Magistrates. Behold my hap, behold my luck, Richard says in his monologue in Mirror for Magistrates. Lo, how the power, the pride, the rich array of mighty rulers lightly fade away. What mold be kings made of but carrion clay? In other words, what is a king but rotting flesh? So in these lines, those lines I just read to you, the incontrovertible fact of human mortality is neatly assimilated to an old metaphysical idea that the world is in fortune's hands. Fortune, like death, comes for us all, but unlike death, she comes again and again in every human life, bestowing favors and imposing losses without regard for human intentions, human activity, or even human virtue. And the title page of Measure for Measure assures us that the universe has a moral order. The wicked will be punished, but its contents are a constant reminder to the contrary, that fortune is a set of effects without human causes. As an unalterable feature of a frail and unstable world, fortune makes inscrutable whatever moral order the universe might have. So the second book that I want to mention as a source for the speech we're discussing today is Petrarch's De Remediis Utriusque Fortunae, which means remedies for both kinds of fortunes. It was written in the 14th century. And here you see the title page of a very, very popular English translation from Shakespeare's lifetime. I'll read you the full title again. Physic against Fortune, as well prosperous as adverse, contained in 2 books, whereby men are instructed with like indifferency to remedy their affections, as well in time of the bright shining sun of prosperity, as also of the foul lowering storms of adversity. Expedient for all men, but most necessary for such as be subject to any notable insult of either extremity. So in its English translation, Petrarch's text consists of 254 dialogues divided into 2 books. In the first, Reason discusses remedies for prosperity with joy. In the second, Reason and Sorrow discuss remedies for adversity. Among the dialogues in that book, one of the ones between Reason and Sorrow is especially relevant for us today. Here are the concluding lines from the dialogue titled On the Loss of a Kingdom. So Sorrow says, I am grieved to see my kingdom transferred to another. Reason, that kingdom surely was not yours. It belongs to Fortune. Since she is able to bestow something on you, why can she not take it away if she wants to and transfer it to someone else? Sorrow, I have ceased to be a king. Reason, you have begun to be a man. Such is the insolence of kings that they are ashamed to be called a man. Yet the King of Kings was not ashamed of it. The model for Petrarch's text is The Consolation of Philosophy, a book consisting of 5 dialogues between Lady Philosophy and the author, Boethius, a 6th century Roman philosopher who was awaiting execution at the hands of his king. Apart from the Bible, The Consolation was the most widely read book in medieval Europe. And here you see, if I can just find it, here you see a miniature from a late 15th century copy. On the left, Lady Philosophy is discussing free will and the nature of good and evil, the prospect of justice, and the limits of human understanding with the very crestfallen Boethius, assuring him through logical arguments that the universe is ordered morally. And on the right, Dame Fortune undermines those arguments by introducing chaos into the realm of human affairs. All of these books assume that fortune, both fortune and bad fortune, is the adversary of virtue and therefore the enemy of human flourishing and contentment. Here are fortune and virtue confronting each other in the frontispiece of Charles de Bouvel's Book of Wisdom, which is an early 16th century text. Fortune is blindfolded, she brandishes her wheel. She sits on a sphere signifying her instability and movement. Opposite her, immovable, on a cube, is virtue, who gazes into the mirror of wisdom and serenely contemplates her own image. This woodcut, which is also from the early 16th century, makes a clear connection between fortune's blind activity and the asinine nature of human self-regard. Here's fortune in the lower right with a blindfold giving the wheel a spin. And on the wheel, you see three versions of a human being. On the left, a jackass with a human face. On the top, a human body with an ass's head and a crown and scepter. And on the way down toward the bottom, what appears to be a full donkey wearing a human garment. I think the idea here is that unless philosophy teaches us who we actually are, fortune is bound to make asses of us all over and over again. Now, for Shakespeare and his contemporaries, and for Richard in the passage today, fortune is not only a force that blindly and irrationally shapes human experiences, it's also the arena in which philosophy must demonstrate its own value by proving that wisdom makes it possible to live a good life in a world where fortune wrecks all human projects. And now finally, we come to Richard's speech. Richard has more lines than any character in the play, amounting to approximately 25% of what we hear. The speech, however, is unique in two senses. First, it is his only soliloquy, the only time that he has been alone in the entire play. And second, it is his first attempt at self-scrutiny and self-criticism. In order to be in this position, Richard has had to give up everything that defined his identity: his armies, his crown and title, his wife, his freedom. And we find him in the dungeon of Pomfret or Pontefract Castle, waiting to see what his cousin, now King Henry IV, is going to do with him. Here is Ben Whishaw in the Hollow Crown production of the play, which I strongly recommend if you're interested in Richard II. On the left, you see King Richard II in his glory. On the right, you see Richard, a man, a bare-forked animal, attempting to philosophize for the first time. I am thrilled to tell you that a special guest star is going to read the speech for us today. My friend Paul Whitworth recently retired as professor of theater arts at UC Santa Cruz. For many years, he was the artistic director of Shakespeare Santa Cruz, which is the professional theater company now known as Santa Cruz Shakespeare. And before moving to Santa Cruz in the 1980s, Paul performed with the Royal Shakespeare Company. So while he is performing the speech for us, I'd ask you to try to hold a few questions in mind, which will enrich our discussion later. First, what is Richard trying to accomplish by thinking and speaking in the way that he does? Right? How does he go about this speech, and does he succeed in reaching his goals? And second, at the end of the speech, does Richard return to the state of mind in which he began? Has he arrived at a new state of mind? If he's changed, how would you describe the change that he has undergone? And in general, is he better or worse off for having engaged in philosophy? All right, Paul. So I recommend that you set your view to speaker view if you're in gallery, so you can get the full effect of Paul's performance. And Paul, whenever you are ready.
Sean, do you think it's worth saying what happens at the end of the speech and explaining your performance?
My performance?
Well, no, your interjection that you're going to do and who you are.
Sure. Paul has asked me to play the minor part of the groom, who comes in right at the end of the soliloquy and says hello to Richard. So when I burst in at the end, that will be the signal for Rich. Yeah.
So Sean is playing the groom who looked after Richard's favorite horse, which he set great store by and which now is being ridden by Bolingbroke. And the groom comes in and may or may not have been the person who is playing the music. Who knows?
Who knows?
Okay. I have been studying how I might compare this prison where I live unto the world. And because the world is populous, and here is not a creature but myself, I cannot do it. Yet I'll hammer it out. My brain, I'll prove the female to my soul the father. And these two beget a generation of still breeding thoughts. And these same thoughts people this little world in humors like the people of this world, for no thought is contented. The better sort, as thoughts of things divine, are intermixed with scruples, and do set the word itself against the word, as thus, come little ones, and then again, it is as hard to come as for a camel to thread the postern of a small needle's eye. Thoughts tending to ambition, they do plot unlikely wonders, how these vain, weak nails may tear a passage through the flinty ribs of this hard world, my ragged prison walls, and for they cannot die in their own pride. Thoughts tending to content, flatter themselves that they are not the first of fortune's slaves, nor shall not be the last. Like silly beggars who sitting in the stocks refuge their shame that many have and others must sit there, and in this thought they find a kind of ease, setting their own misfortunes on the back of such as have before endured the like. Thus play I, in one person, many people, and none contented. Sometimes am I king, then treasons make me wish myself a beggar, and so I am. Then crushing penury persuades me I was better when a king. Then am I kinged again, and by think that I am unkinged by Bolingbroke, and straight am nothing. But whate'er I be, nor I nor any man that but man is, with nothing shall be pleased till he be eased by being nothing. Music do I hear? Oh, keep time. How sour sweet music is when time is broke and no proportion kept. So is it in the music of men's lives. And here have I the daintiness of ear to check time broke in a disordered string, but for the concord of my state and time, had not an ear to hear my true time broke. I wasted time, and now doth time waste me. For now hath time made me his numbering clock. My thoughts are minutes, and with sighs they jar their watches on unto mine eyes, the outward watch, whereto my finger, like a dial's point, is pointing still in cleansing them from tears. Now, sir, the sound that tells what hour it is, a clamorous groans that strike upon my heart, which is the bell, so sighs and tears and groans show minutes, times and hours, but my time runs posting on in Bolingbroke's proud joy, while I stand fooling here is Jack of the clock. Oh, this music mads me. Let it sound no more. For though it hath hope, madmen to their wits, in me it seems it will make wise men mad. Yet, blessing on his heart that gives it me, for 'tis a sign of love. And love to Richard is a strange brooch in this all-hating world.
Hail, royal prince!
Thanks, noble peer.
So the speech is 66 lines long, 67 with the exchange between the groom and Richard. It's written in unrhymed iambic pentameter. At line 41, you'll have noticed that the interruption music playing in the other chamber divides the speech into two parts, and these parts have different topics, but they unfold rhetorically in similar ways. I'm going to share my screen with you again briefly, and while I go through the speech, I'll be moving back and forth between the first and the second parts in order to draw your attention to parallel constructions and developments, so I hope that won't be too confusing. Both parts of the speech begin with a question. How is a prison cell like the world? How is living like playing music without regard for timing? Next, Richard explores these questions in highly imaginative and metaphorical ways. The imagination turns out to be an essential condition of possibility for wisdom and philosophizing. In the first part of the speech, he imagines that three kinds of thoughts populate his prison cell and keep him company. Thoughts of things divine, thoughts tending to ambition, and thoughts that appear to lead to contentment, but are actually self-flattering. In the second part of the speech, Richard imagines that he is a clock on which time tells itself through his tears, sighs, and groans. In both parts of the speech, Richard makes generalizations about the way the world is or how other people spend their time, but then philosophy inexorably lends him back to the problem of himself. At line 31, he acknowledges that the thoughts about other people with which he filled his prison cell are actually reflections of himself, and specifically of his discontentment, not of the humors of the people of the world. In the second part of the speech, he moves more quickly to scrutinize and criticize himself. He acknowledges that there is something ludicrous about his reaction to the music, and also that he is more blameworthy for misusing his time as a king than the musician in the next room is to blame for playing poorly. And I want to suggest strongly that these developments are meaningful. By no means has Richard transcended his misfortunes or the feelings that go with them, but he has begun to see himself and other people, I guess, even though he can't see the musician, he's begun to see himself and other people in a new perspective. Richard can't scrutinize himself for long, however, without calling to mind his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, and his new awareness of himself is inextricably tied to the man who stole his crown. In both parts of the speech, a reference to Bolingbroke gives rise to turbulent passions. First, Bolingbroke's name reminds Richard of his losses. He repeats the word nothing 3 times in 4 lines as though to relive his deposition as an annihilation. At the end of the next part of the speech, Richard's knowledge that in being nothing, he is equal to every other human being carries him to the brink of madness. However, let me draw your attention to an important difference between these 2 moments. Here they are. At the end of the first part of the speech, Richard finds himself alone in the cell, pondering the bitter thought that the only remedy for his discontentment is death. philosophy appears not to have succeeded in consoling him, much less in making him contented with his lot. The second part of the speech, however, and therefore the speech as a whole, ends on a different note. And I think the degree to which we can regard this soliloquy as a meaningful response to fortune, as an example of Shakespeare's wisdom, turns on whether we understand what happens here as a transformation of Richard's perspective and behavior. Nothing has changed about his material circumstances, and his final reference to this all-hating world suggests Richard remains captive to his discontentment. In fact, earlier in the play, he cleaved to his misery as the last trace of his unique identity. "You may my glories and my state depose," he said to Bolingbroke, "but not my griefs. Still am I king of those." And yet, at the end of his soliloquy, Richard changes his mind about the music playing in the next room. He no longer complains about the quality of the performance. Instead, he acknowledges the music as a kindness, and he reciprocates that kindness with the only thing that he has to give, a blessing. Just listening to Paul, I realized that blessing, love, love sort of replaces nothing, nothing, nothing from the first part of the speech. And then, in a second gesture of humility and generosity, Richard hails the lowly groom as a noble peer. If this is a joke, it seems to be at the expense of the social conventions that suppose that the groom's life has less value than Richard's, that they are not fundamentally the same as human beings. So my thought is that perhaps this is what contentment is for Shakespeare in this scene: the capacity to regard another person as the equal of oneself, and a willingness to respond with gratitude to whatever fortune comes one's way. I also like the comment that the Cummings are making here, that it's easy to imagine a counter consideration if the speech were to go on. And in fact, those of you who know what happens next in the play, an assassin comes to kill Richard, and Richard sort of, for the first and only time in the play, rallies himself as a warrior and defends his life. He doesn't succeed, but he sort of, for a moment, becomes a king worthy of the name, I guess you could say, from a certain perspective. So whatever is happening to him in the passage that we looked at, it doesn't result in a kind of sage-like resignation to his fate, right? That's one of the reasons why I'm interested in this speech, that it is a momentary, it's a transient achievement of a kind in which he's able to see himself and the groom as the same, rather than as opposites in a vertically organized social hierarchy.
And here's a comment from the earlier part of your presentation, a question from Shauna. What about the option of reading something and have the reader decide that he disagrees and therefore wants to become the opposite? Could you comment on that in terms of Renaissance theories of reading, exemplarity, counter-exemplarity?
Yes, I sure can. To take the example of classical literature, so pre-Christian, non-biblical fictions, such as Ovid's Metamorphoses or Virgil's Aeneid, they were subject to really intense skepticism as school subjects by Puritan intellectuals and theologians in Shakespeare's period. Everyone seemed to agree that eloquent writing was bound to have a profound effect on the development of character. And the question was, what kind of effect was it bound to have? And was the reader actually in charge of the experience of reading, right? So the same people who wanted to shut down the theaters because they diffused lewdness into the society at large and turned men into women or women to men, all of the sort of insane things that were said about the theater in the late 16th century were also being said about the humanist school curriculum, right? Reading Ovid would make you worse. And on the contrary, the defenders of that curriculum, like the defenders of the theater, would argue that in fact, learning how to read was learning how to endure sort of virtual moral crisis so that you could develop the capacity for behaving virtuously in the real world when you encountered real crises. Arthur Golding, who's one of the early translators of Ovid's Metamorphoses, that's the translation that Shakespeare knew and that Ezra Pound thought was the most beautiful poem in English. Arthur Golding says that reading Virgil, reading Ovid, is like seeing your best and worst selves rise to the surface of the poem and compel you to make a choice between them, right? So even defenders of these realize that there's a sort of critical moment in which things could go very right or very wrong. Interestingly, no one seems to think that reading could leave you indifferent. And I think that's very different from the way in general we read now, or at least the way we read secular writing in the West, which is to say, we regard it as something that we consume for pleasure, right? And that if we really like it or if we really don't, it has absolutely no impact on our development unless we allow it to, right? Unless the one objection to that argument that I can think of making is sort of intelligent science fiction. For example, Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun, which is about the creation of an artificial intelligence, a robot, to serve as a child's companion. If you think about artificial intelligence in our contemporary science fiction as a modern example of the way that Shakespeare's contemporaries thought about fictions in general, right? As artificial forms of life that would have a big impact on you, whether you wanted them to have that impact or not. You can understand that we're alive to this possibility. That robot, Clara, changes the people with whom she interacts, even though they may not be fully aware of the way that they're changing in relation to her. So artificial intelligence and robots is sort of a virtual life in our science fiction, maybe the closest we come, I'm trying to say in this long-winded way, to the experience of reading ancient literature or encountering drama in Shakespeare's period.
Fascinating. I'm halfway through the novel, so don't tell me how it ends. We have a couple of other comments here about music. Filippo asks about the role of music in this soliloquy. Does its consolatory effect have something to do with Boethius? This is a very learned comment, opposed to wisdom's rebuke of elegiac poetry at the beginning of the Consolatio. Boethius wrote a treatise on music, but does music play any role in the consolation of philosophy? It is a prosometron generically, right? So there are
it's an alternation of songs and prose passages, right?
Yeah.
The person asking this question is my dear colleague, Filippo, who is a medievalist and knows very well how music works in medieval texts. So, I'm going to sort of slightly escape from the interest of that question by saying that the key thing, I think, for Shakespeare is that the music is being badly played, right? I mean, you might imagine that if the music was being beautifully played, it could lead Richard on to some abstract philosophical reflections on harmony, right? And the way in which what Bolingbroke has done to him is a violation of the harmony of the cosmic order that has, firstborn sons on top and everyone else below. But in fact, the fact that the music is badly played is the opportunity that the music gives him to reflect on his own behavior, right, and his own motivations. He's forced to, Paul might have something to say about this too, but Richard is forced to contemplate over and over and over again in the play that the way he thinks the world is organized is not actually correct, right? That a king is not a divinely appointed sacred being. A king is the person who's able to play the role of king most persuasively, right? And he isn't that. So the music that is being badly played, I think, triggers in him some reflection that he has played his part as king badly. And that's partly why he's talking about the theater at the end of the first part of the speech. Thus play I many parts, right? The play that he's in, I guess you could argue, is imagining a transition from an older way of thinking about monarchy to a new way. The older way is theology, and the newer way is politics, right? In the old way, kings are sacred beings. In the new way, kings are actors, right? And so the badly played music, Filippo, I think, is a sort of further reminder of something being profoundly out of tune across the whole range of the play world.
So we're
Paul, do you have
almost
any thoughts about the music?
We're almost out of time. I just wanted to acknowledge we have a very nice comparison from Cheryl between Macbeth and Richard in terms of where they are at the end of the play. And then we also have a beautiful observation from K2 comparing Lear and the Fool to Richard and the Groom here. Do you want to maybe give Paul the last word here, since Sean, you want to ask Paul a question, and then we'll stay for a few minutes for anyone who wants to discourse?
Sure. My question for Paul would be, what is the most important thing about this speech from an actor's perspective? What is it that we need to know in order to understand the speech from the inside?
Well, I always felt that playing Richard is a bit like a striptease. You start with a secret, which is the fact that you are both a divinely inspired monarch, anointed monarch, and you are a murderer as a man. You've murdered your uncle Woodstock, which is very well explained in the previous play, Woodstock, the anonymous play, which I'm sure Shakespeare and probably his audience knew. But so you've got a guilty man, but also a holy man by virtue of his office. And that there are 7 big scenes it's like the Dance of the 7 Veils. And in each one, Richard has to rip off something which he thinks is going to solve it, but it isn't enough. So it's a series of discoveries, 7 discoveries going right down to the core. And something you said, Sean, at the end, that the wisdom he achieves, the equality he achieves with the meeting between the highest person in the play and the lowliest person in the play, the king and the groom, come face to face. He does find that equality. But I would suggest there's one more scene to go, and his murder. And when having found that equality for the first time in the play, in a way, I felt that he had found his real kingship again. Because at the end, even though Bolingbroke is now king, he says, "Exton, thy fierce hand hath with the king's blood stained the king's own land." So he's become the king again. And then he says, "Mount, mount, my soul, thy seat is up on high, whilst my gross flesh sinks downward here to die." And the two things which were so horribly interwoven, secretly and subterraneously, subtextually interwoven at the start of the play, cleanly separate. The husk goes into the ground and the spirit rises up. And the spirit that rises up is his definition of holy kingship, which he throws so high that poor old Bolingbroke can't catch up with it in the whole of the rest of the cycle. And even Henry V is haunted the night before Agincourt, saying, "Oh God, forgive the sin my father made encompassing the crown." So the work you do as Richard II polishes that crown and rids that crown of horrible human guilt so perfectly that neither Henry IV nor Henry V can catch it.
Wow.
So I don't think that's the end. I don't think it's a temporary thing. I think it's part of a long trip from this haunted man who opens the play in that awful position of presiding over the duel, where, he's sacrificing two people for his own sin. And then finally taking it on in the only way he can, which is by self-sacrifice. But he doesn't realize that at the start. So it's a voyage of discovery all the way through the play, how much it's going to cost.
Fantastic. And I wanted to say we've got some amazing comments in the chat. I am saving the chats, and we'll figure out at some point how to share those with you. But we've got great comments from Ariane and Vivian and other people. Sean, this was incredible. Paul, it was so great to have you part of this inquiry, part of the process of Richard discovering himself and polishing that crown. Sean, anything you want to say before we let people go?
Hope to see you next week. Do you know what our topic for next week
is,
Julia?
We're going to be looking at As You Like It. We'll be looking at Duke Sr.'s speech to his co-mates and brothers in exile. I think the theme is fortitude. It's not a word that he actually uses in the speech, but I will find my way to a key word as I continue to engage with the passage. So I hope to see all of you next week, or as many of you as possible next week. And it was great to share the hour with you.